I remember the first time I saw the yacht lying on the ocean floor, twisted and broken like a carcass in the deep. The water was darker than black, and something about the silence made my skin crawl, like the sea itself was holding its breath. I had been told there were 9 rules to survive down here, rules whispered between divers like a lifeline, but none of them made sense until you hear the hum beneath the waves, the faint scrape against metal that no one else sees. I thought I was prepared, until I felt movement just beyond my mask, and I realized breaking even one rule could be the last mistake I ever made. The first time I set foot on the sunken yacht, I remember the water pressing in around me like a cold hand, tugging at my wetsuit and my nerves. The broken hull creaked with every current, and sunlight had long since vanished, leaving only the pale shimmer of my flashlight. I told myself Rule 1 was just a superstition, a guideline for nervous divers, but the moment I reached the cabin doorway, a shiver ran down my spine. The dark interior seemed alive, the shadows curling into shapes that weren't there a second before. I tried to focus on the instruments strapped to my body, my breath shallow, telling myself it was only water and metal. I had my partner, Marco, with me, hovering nearby with his flashlight aimed at the deck. "Are you really going in there?" he asked, his voice echoing oddly, like it belonged to someone else entirely. I nodded, though Rule 1 throbbed in my mind. A warning I didn't want to admit was real. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, my breath fogging in the murky water. Every loose plank groaned, every fragment of furniture swayed, and I thought I heard whispers, soft and indecipherable, as if the yacht itself was exhaling. I cursed silently, trying to shake the feeling, but Rule 1 was already alive in my thoughts. The cabin smelled faintly of rust and salt, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I floated forward, scanning the control panels and scattered charts, pretending I was mapping the wreck when in truth, I was mapping every shadow, every twitch of movement in the corners. Marco hovered at the entrance, muttering to himself about the currents, but I could see his hands trembling. "Maybe the rules aren't so strict," he said, but I knew he was lying to convince himself. Rule 1 echoed in my mind, never enter the main cabin after sunset. Yet here I was, drawn toward a faint glimmer on the far wall. I reached out, and my hand brushed against something cold and rigid, the edge of a chart table, and I felt the faintest brush of something soft behind me. I spun, my flashlight beam slicing through the murk, but nothing moved, at least nothing that should have. "Did you feel that?" I whispered, more to myself than to Marco, but he shook his head, eyes wide. The shadows seemed to lean closer, drawn to our presence, and I realized Rule 1 wasn't just caution, it was a boundary. Crossing it wasn't harmless. It made the yacht aware of you, like a predator sensing prey in still water. Time passed in distorted minutes as we moved deeper into the cabin, inspecting drawers and cupboards that had been pried open long before we arrived. Every object felt like a relic of lives interrupted, frozen in waterlogged silence, and the sense of being watched grew heavier. I tried to joke to Marco, to diffuse the tension, but the words died in my throat when the light flickered, and I caught a glimpse of a reflection that wasn't mine. Rule 1 screamed at me then, louder than any current or groan of metal, and I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could feel it, something just beyond vision, waiting for a mistake. I backed slowly toward the entrance, each movement deliberate, every bubble rising from my regulator, a tiny signal to whatever lurked in the dark. Marco was mumbling about turning back, but even he hesitated, hypnotized by the pull of the cabin. It was then I realized the rules weren't suggestions, they were survival measures, and breaking them brought attention. Rule 1 wasn't about superstition, it was about staying unseen, about keeping distance from something that wanted to draw us into its depths. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to remember every detail, every edge of the doorway, preparing for the retreat. As we turned to leave, a sudden shadow moved across the far corner, slower than any current should allow. My heart stuttered, and my hands shook on my flashlight. "Did you see that?" Marco whispered, gripping my arm, his eyes wide with fear. I nodded, barely able to speak, my mind repeating Rule 1 like a mantra. The shadow lingered, stretched, and then receded into the deeper darkness, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. The cabin seemed to sigh, or maybe it was me, realizing that each rule carried weight I had no idea about until now. We retreated to the deck, and I forced myself to take measured breaths, letting the cold press of the water remind me I was alive. Marco refused to speak, just floated silently, eyes darting back toward the cabin. I whispered the words aloud, though my voice felt swallowed by the surrounding black. Rule 1: never enter after sunset. The repetition was comforting, grounding me, a reminder that some rules were meant to be obeyed, no matter how skeptical you were. Yet even as I said it, I felt a pull, a lure back toward the darkness, a curiosity that was dangerous to indulge. I sat against the hull, trying to calm the tremor in my limbs, replaying every detail, every shadow, every movement that had felt wrong. The light from my flashlight trembled, and I felt a presence just out of reach. Marco finally spoke, a broken laugh escaping him. Maybe the rules are for the weak. I clenched my fists, knowing he was tempting fate, testing Rule 1, and part of me hated that I couldn't stop thinking about what might have followed us if we stayed longer. My mind raced, imagining shapes in the water, echoes of whispers, the pressure of unseen eyes that followed every motion. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, and I realized that breaking Rule 1 wasn't just a warning, it was a measurement. The yacht had judged our curiosity, and though we had retreated in time, I could feel it watching still, patient and waiting. Every shadow on the deck, every sway of the broken railing, every flicker of bubbles reminded me that the rule had saved us. I couldn't let it go, couldn't let skepticism tempt me again, because Rule 1 wasn't just a guideline, it was a lifeline in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. By the time we surfaced and reached the shallower waters near the wreck's edge, my thoughts were a tangle of fear and fascination. I kept replaying the cabin in my mind, the pull it had exerted, the cold weight of unseen eyes. I understood now that these rules, starting with Rule 1, weren't about common sense. They were about survival, about keeping distance from forces and presences I didn't yet understand. Marco glanced at me, hesitant, and muttered, "We shouldn't come back tonight." I nodded, though part of me ached to return, knowing that obeying Rule 1 was only the first of 9. Even now, hours later, I can't shake the image of that shadow, the silent tension in the cabin, the pull of curiosity that nearly cost us both. I know I have to follow Rule 1 again tomorrow, but the rest of the rules, they wait below, waiting for me to test them, to break them, or to survive. The sunken yacht is patient, and the rules are patient too, each one a line I can't cross without consequences. I can still feel the tug, the whisper of danger beneath the waves, reminding me that the ocean isn't forgiving, and neither are the rules I must obey. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of the shadows in the main cabin. Even though I'd obeyed Rule 1, the way the darkness had seemed to lean toward us left a cold weight in my chest. I floated above the wreck, scanning the scattered remnants of the yacht with Marco beside me. But my gaze kept drifting back to the captain's cabin. Its door was half broken, swinging slightly with the current, and I could almost feel the pull of curiosity, whispering that nothing bad would happen if we just looked closer. But Rule 2 echoed in my mind, never touch any object inside the captain's cabin. Marco noticed my hesitation and smirked nervously. "You're not thinking of going in there again, are you?" I shook my head, though my eyes betrayed me. I know, Rule 2, I murmured. But my hands itched to reach out, to touch one of the corroded charts lying on the desk. The objects were ancient now, eaten by salt and time, yet there was something alive about them, as if they were holding secrets that would punish anyone foolish enough to interfere. I felt a strange mix of fear and temptation, knowing that touching anything would break the rule, and perhaps something else I didn't yet understand. We hovered silently above the cabin's threshold, the water around us thick with suspended particles, that glittered in our flashlight beams. I could almost imagine the objects moving slightly, shifting when we weren't looking, as if the yacht was aware of our hesitation. Marco laughed, an uneasy sound that bounced off the walls of the hull. "It's just debris, nothing more. Rule 2 is ridiculous." My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe him, to dismiss the warnings like I had before, but Rule 2 wasn't written for doubt. It was written for survival. Every instinct screamed that the captain's cabin held more than mere furniture or charts. As we drifted closer, I tried to steady my breathing, counting in my head to calm the rising panic. My flashlight beam fell on the captain's desk, and I could see a ledger half submerged, pages curling in the current. "Don't," I whispered, my voice catching as if speaking aloud would summon consequences. Marco's fingers hovered over the desk, curiosity warring with caution. I grabbed his wrist, the metal of his dive suit cold against mine, and hissed, "Remember Rule 2, we don't touch anything. Not a single thing." He froze, and for a moment the cabin was silent, as if listening to our thoughts. The deeper we moved into the captain's domain, the heavier the water seemed to press on us. The objects, charts, navigation tools, a compass, looked innocent, but each one seemed to vibrate with something unnatural. I felt my hand brush a fragment of wood without meaning to, and instantly a shiver ran down my spine. Shadows flickered in the corners, slower than the current, and I could sense eyes watching. Rule 2 was alive, tangible, a tether keeping us from something we couldn't see but could feel. I jerked back, shaking, realizing that hesitation wasn't enough. You had to obey completely. Marco exhaled slowly, attempting humor to mask fear. "Maybe it's just a sunken yacht, nothing more," he said. But the way the ledger on the desk seemed to tilt toward us with the current suggested otherwise. My mind raced, remembering Rule 1 and how breaking its boundary had drawn the cabin's attention. Now, with Rule 2, we were being tested in a more subtle, dangerous way. The objects weren't just debris, they were traps, each one a silent warning. I fought the urge to reach out again, my muscles trembling, knowing that the smallest mistake could set off something the rules were designed to prevent. We drifted above the desk, suspended in the eerie stillness, every heartbeat echoing in my ears. My flashlight illuminated a compass that seemed to spin on its own, slow and deliberate, as if pointing somewhere unseen. I whispered, almost to myself, "Rule 2, don't touch." The words were barely audible, but the effect was immediate. The air, or rather the water, seemed to still the faint hum beneath the wreck, fading for just a second. I realized that the rules weren't threats. They were boundaries enforced by something that existed in the quiet, patient depths of the yacht. Suddenly, a metallic clang rang from deeper inside the cabin, startling both of us. Marco flinched and muttered, "That didn't come from me." My heart hammered as I realized that even our presence, even hovering without touching, might have been noticed. Rule 2 wasn't just about objects. It was about respect, about acknowledging the power that lingered in this place. I felt a pull toward the ledger again, the faint promise of answers, but the knowledge of the rule forced my hand away. I clenched my fists, willing my curiosity to obey. Time stretched, minutes dripping into an eternity as we hovered in tense silence. The captain's cabin seemed to breathe around us, each object vibrating with a life of its own. I could sense the rules stretching, watching, calculating. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to leave the objects untouched, yet part of me wanted to reach out, to feel their cold weight and glimpse the secrets they carried. Marco glanced at me, eyes wide, and I whispered, almost reverently, "We obey Rule 2, or we don't leave." The understanding passed silently between us, unspoken but clear. Finally, we began to drift backward toward the main deck, leaving the captain's cabin behind. The ledger stayed untouched, the compass unmoved, yet I could feel them watching, sensing our compliance. Marco exhaled, finally breaking the silence. "I didn't touch anything. Thank God." I nodded, but a part of me shivered, realizing that the rules were not just warnings, they were lifelines. thin threads holding us to safety in a place designed to consume the careless. Rule 2 had been obeyed, yet the subtle tension in the water reminded me that the next rule was waiting, ready to escalate the danger. Even now, floating just above the deck, I can't forget the sensation of unseen eyes on every object. Rule 2 had taught me restraint, patience, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. I knew that the remaining rules were waiting, each more complex, more dangerous, and more personal than the last. The sunken yacht wasn't just a wreck, it was a living test, and every object in the captain's cabin was part of that test. The rules were clear, and my only hope was to follow them, to survive, and to uncover the secrets beneath, without giving in to temptation. After barely escaping the pull of the captain's cabin, I knew the next step demanded even more caution. The water around the yacht was deceptively calm, but the deeper I moved, the more I felt the pressure of unseen forces pressing in from all sides. I clipped a tether line to my suit, the cord a fragile lifeline connecting me to the safety above. Rule 3. Always keep a line tethered to the surface whenever entering any enclosed area, pulsed in my mind with every stroke I took, reminding me that even a moment's lapse could mean getting lost, or worse, in the twisted corridors of the sunken vessel. Marco followed close behind, his flashlight bouncing over the wreck like nervous eyes scanning for threats. The corridor leading to the engine room was narrow, constricting, and the remnants of furniture caught on the walls, snagging our equipment. I gritted my teeth, keeping the tether taut, reminding myself that Rule 3 was not just precaution, it was survival. One wrong turn, and the line could tangle or snap under the pressure, leaving us adrift in blackness. I could feel the yacht's silent attention, a patient weight pressing in, observing our every motion. Marco paused, glancing at me nervously. "Are we really going deeper?" he whispered, the cord taut between us. I nodded, swallowing my fear, knowing we had no choice. The engine room entrance loomed ahead, rusted and half collapsed, but the line tethered above gave me a strange sense of security. The water here smelled of oil and decay, thick and clinging to our suits. Shadows moved unnaturally, stretching along the beams and broken consoles. Rule 3 demanded focus. Without the tether, even my own hands felt alien in this dark, twisting space. I reached out to steady myself against a bulkhead, careful not to touch anything in violation of Rule 2, my fingers brushing only the metal edges. The yacht seemed to shift subtly, as though sensing our caution. Marco's flashlight caught something glinting in the corner, an old wrench lying half buried in silt. He hesitated, then whispered, "Maybe we should check that." I shook my head sharply, gripping the tether. Rule 3, Marco, the tether, and we don't touch anything. His jaw tightened, and he reluctantly let go of the temptation. I could feel the tension in the water around us, an almost sentient awareness pressing in. Every object here seemed alive, watching, judging. The tether wasn't just a lifeline, it was a connection to safety, a reminder that we weren't meant to wander freely without consequence. Moving further inside, the corridor narrowed even more, and debris scraped against our suits. The tether vibrated faintly as the current shifted, a warning I could feel in my fingertips. I had to keep my movements deliberate, precise, and mindful of the line at all times. Shadows flickered across the engine room's doorway, and I could sense Marco's unease. "I don't like this. It's too quiet," he muttered, echoing my own thoughts. Rule 3 pulsed in my mind with every stroke, the knowledge that the tether wasn't just a guideline, it was a promise of survival in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. As we entered the engine room, the water felt heavier, thick with sediment stirred from years of decay. I clutched the tether tightly, guiding myself along the jagged metal beams, and could feel the yacht's awareness pressing closer. Lights from our flashlights flickered over rusted machinery and broken pipes, but deeper shadows remained untouched, hiding secrets we weren't meant to see yet. I whispered the rule aloud, more to ground myself than for Marco. Rule 3, always keep a line to the surface. It's the only way out if things go wrong. The cord vibrated slightly, like a pulse, as if agreeing or warning. Suddenly, a shadow passed over us, elongated and impossibly fast. My heart jumped, and I tightened my grip on the tether. Marco froze, eyes wide, staring at the darkness ahead. "Did you see that?" he whispered, voice trembling. I could only nod, my throat tight, the tether my only anchor in a world that seemed determined to consume curiosity. Rule 3 was alive now, a lifeline in a place where the smallest mistake could leave you lost in the suffocating black forever. I forced myself to focus, each movement calculated, each thought tethered to survival. The engine room was a labyrinth of pipes, broken gauges, and corroded machinery. The tether guided me like a silent instructor, a strict reminder that straying even a few feet could be fatal. I watched the cord ripple with the water's currents, a fragile lifeline connecting us to the surface, to safety. Marco stayed close, following my lead, his fear palpable in the small bubbles escaping his regulator. Rule 3 wasn't just about safety, it was about control, maintaining the thin thread of reality, while everything around us seemed bent on pulling us into chaos. A sudden current slammed into the wreck, tossing sediment and debris in every direction. My flashlight barely penetrated the clouded water, and I gripped the tether as tightly as I could. The shadow from before lingered, just beyond the beam, and I could feel its attention, patient and unyielding. Marco whispered, almost pleading, "We shouldn't be here." I clenched my teeth, repeating Rule 3 in my mind, letting the tether remind me of what mattered. This cord was more than nylon. It was the only connection to the world that might save us from whatever waited in the sunken depths. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as we traced the engine room's corridors, careful not to touch, careful to stay tethered, careful to breathe. The yacht seemed to pulse around us, alive in the shadows and the currents, testing our obedience. Every movement reinforced the importance of Rule 3, the line connecting us to survival. Marco's nerves were fraying, but he never let go of the tether, and neither did I. Somewhere deeper in the wreck, I felt the presence of the unknown, patient and deliberate, waiting for the moment one of us might falter. By the time we surfaced again, gasping under the sunlit water, my arms ached from clinging to the tether, and my mind was buzzing with tension. Rule 3 had saved us, but I knew it was only the beginning. The sunken yacht had rules beyond comprehension, each one escalating in danger and personal stakes. I glanced at Marco, whose face was pale but relieved, and whispered, "We survived this, but the next one won't be easy." The tether still floated beside me, a reminder that the rules were lifelines, fragile threads connecting us to survival in the silent, patient abyss. Even after surfacing from the engine room, the wreck's pull lingered, a subtle pressure in my chest that refused to release me. My eyes kept drifting back to the hull, where rusted winches and old diving ladders jutted into the water like skeletal fingers. Rule 4 pulsed in my mind, a warning I couldn't ignore: never remove or disturb any equipment attached to the hull. Every line, every rusted beam seemed alive, a silent network that watched and judged our every move. Marco floated beside me, nervously adjusting his lights, the tension between us palpable in the heavy water. I approached the hull cautiously, brushing past a broken lifeboat hook that swayed slightly in the current. The water felt thicker here, each movement more deliberate, each breath heavier than the last. I could see remnants of ropes and tools that had once served the yacht's crew, now corroded and fragile. Rule 4 insisted that I treat them as sacred, untouchable, because disturbing even the smallest fragment could trigger consequences we didn't understand. Marco hovered beside me, clearly struggling with the urge to investigate, his fingers twitching as if to reach for a dangling chain. A strong current pushed past us, rattling the hull and sending sediment swirling into the water. My flashlight beam caught a rusted anchor embedded in the deck, and I felt a pull, almost magnetic, urging me to touch it. My stomach twisted as I remembered Rule 4, and I clenched my fists, forcing my hands to float harmlessly past the anchor. The yacht seemed to sigh, or perhaps it was just my imagination, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Marco's eyes widened as he followed my movements, realizing instinctively that obeying the rule was the only way to avoid something far worse than curiosity. The deeper I traced along the hull, the more dangerous the wreck became. Twisted metal, broken railing, and jagged pipes threatened to snag our suits or tear our gloves. I had to maneuver carefully, mindful of Rule 4, reminding myself that touching or removing anything could trigger consequences we couldn't foresee. Shadows flickered against the hull, distorted by the wavering light, and I felt the weight of history pressing down on us. Marco whispered, almost reverently, "I've never seen a wreck so aware," and I nodded, knowing he meant the same thing I felt. The yacht was more than wood and steel. A loose cable dangled temptingly, swaying with the current, its frayed ends catching the flashlight's glow. My fingers itched to grasp it, to pull it free, but I stopped, forcing my hands to float harmlessly past. Rule 4 repeated itself in my mind, like a mantra: never remove or disturb anything attached to the hull. Every instinct screamed that even the smallest movement could awaken something patient and dangerous beneath the wreck. Marco exhaled sharply beside me, his nerves fraying, but he too respected the invisible boundary imposed by the rule. As we moved along, the water seemed to thicken, the shadows stretching and curling around the hull, as if trying to lure us into contact with the rusty debris. I glanced at the remnants of old diving equipment still attached to the beams, and a shiver ran down my spine. Rule 4 wasn't just about the physical act of touching, it was about acknowledging a force we couldn't see, about respecting invisible lines of power that ran through the wreck. I forced myself to float past a dangling pulley, my hands shaking, while Marco followed, silent and tense. The sound of a distant collapse echoed through the water, metal groaning as if the wreck itself shifted slightly. My heart pounded, and I gripped the tether from Rule 3 tighter, a lifeline reminding me that obedience was survival. Marco whispered, "We have to be careful, one wrong move." I nodded, mentally rehearsing Rule 4 over and over. Every piece of equipment attached to the hull carried an unspoken threat, a hidden consequence for those foolish enough to tamper with it. Even the smallest disturbance could awaken something lurking in the dark. I traced the hull toward the stern, careful to keep my hands and fins from snagging anything, and noticed remnants of ropes tangled around old winches. The ropes swayed lazily, but the movement felt deliberate, almost alive. Rule 4 kept my hands at bay, my mind aware that curiosity here was dangerous. Marco shivered beside me, muttering, "It's like the wreck is waiting." I swallowed, feeling the tug of unseen eyes on every piece of rusted metal. Obedience to Rule 4 wasn't just wise, it was essential. By the time we reached a small clearing, near the back of the wreck, I was exhausted, muscles burning from constant vigilance. Yet the rule remained clear in my mind: disturb nothing, remove nothing. The wreck itself seemed to relax slightly, its pressure on us easing as we respected its boundaries. Marco exhaled, relief flickering in his expression, and I whispered to myself, "Rule 4, it's keeping us alive." But I knew, deep down, that the rules were only growing more complex, more dangerous. The sunken yacht was patient, and it was waiting for us to encounter the next one. Even as we surfaced briefly to check our tether lines, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes tracing our movements along the hull. Rule 4 had kept us safe this far, but the next rule was already waiting, ready to escalate the danger beyond anything we'd faced. The yacht's presence was patient, deliberate, and unyielding, and I knew our obedience was only temporary protection. Every shadow, every rusted beam, every floating fragment reminded me that the next step would be harder, and the rules that followed would demand more than simple restraint. Even after surfacing briefly to check our tether, the water around the wreck felt heavier, almost thick with anticipation. I could see Marco nervously adjusting his gear, his eyes darting to the dark corners of the hull. Rule 5 thundered in my mind: never remove your mask or regulator underwater. The thought of what could happen if we did sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just oxygen I needed, it was protection, a barrier between me and whatever watched from the shadows below. I clenched my jaw, reminding myself that disobedience could cost more than panic. It could cost life itself. The wreck's corridors stretched before us, like the arms of a long-dead giant, each twist and turn more confining than the last. I kept my hands tight on the tether from Rule 3, my flashlight cutting through the murk, illuminating fragments of the sunken yacht. The smell of decay was stronger here, the water thick with the remnants of time. Marco floated beside me, silent now, clearly fighting the urge to touch anything or test the limits of the rules. Rule 5 wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining every thread of control, every connection to life above the water. As we drifted deeper toward the lower deck, I noticed my mask fogging slightly despite my careful adjustments. A sudden, stronger current pushed us, swirling sediment around our fins and making it hard to see. I tightened my grip on the tether, reminding myself that Rule 5 demanded total adherence. Removing my mask or regulator, even for a second, would mean surrendering control to the water and to whatever else lingered in the yacht's shadowed depths. I could feel a presence, patient and deliberate, following our every motion. Marco's breathing seemed unnaturally loud in his regulator, bubbles floating lazily upward. He muttered under his breath, "I can't tell if it's my imagination." I shook my head, whispering firmly, "Rule 5, Marco. Don't even think about it." His hands twitched, and I knew the temptation to remove the mask to see more clearly, or wipe fog, was nearly irresistible. The wreck seemed aware of every hesitation, every twitch, and I realized that Rule 5 was not just precaution. It was a tether between sanity and chaos, between life and something far darker. We passed a corridor lined with portholes, the glass shattered and encrusted with barnacles. The faint light filtering from above seemed to ripple oddly, reflecting shapes that weren't real. I forced myself to ignore the urge to pull off my mask to look closer, knowing Rule 5 was as much mental as physical. Each second without temptation was a battle. Every movement needed to be deliberate and controlled. Marco exhaled sharply, bubbles streaming upward like a warning signal, and I realized he was fighting the same instinct. Suddenly, a shadow passed over us, elongated and unnatural, stretching along the walls like a living smear. My heart pounded, and I tightened the straps of my mask, anchoring myself in the rule. Rule 5 demanded I stay sealed, tethered, protected, or risk whatever lurked here, claiming even a small misstep. Marco's grip on the tether tightened beside me, his hands trembling. "I don't know if I can keep it on," he whispered, fear evident in his tone. I shook my head sharply, pressing the rule into both our minds, silently repeating, "No, we follow Rule 5. We navigated through the lower deck slowly, our lights cutting paths through the dark, swirling water. Every object, every shadow seemed alive, moving in ways that defied currents or physics. I could feel the yacht's awareness intensifying, a patient, deliberate pressure pressing through the water. Rule 5 wasn't just a precaution, it was an anchor. Without it, the air in my lungs might not be enough, and the shadows around us seemed ready to claim anything foolish enough to expose themselves. I clenched my fists, letting the rule steady me as we passed further into the wreck's belly. A sudden tug on the tether made my heart skip. Marco had brushed against a loose railing, and the shadow seemed to linger there, watching. I whispered, almost desperately, "Rule 5, don't remove it, don't even think about it." The shadows shifted with our movements, patient, deliberate, testing our obedience. I realized that every rule up to this point had prepared us, but Rule 5 demanded total discipline. One lapse could unravel everything we had survived so far, and I could feel the yacht waiting, anticipating a single careless moment. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as we traced the lower deck, careful to obey every previous rule, while keeping Rule 5 alive in our minds. The water seemed to hum faintly, almost as if approving our restraint. Marco finally exhaled with relief, his grip on the tether loosening slightly, and I forced myself to relax just enough to keep moving. I whispered to him, "We survived this section because we obeyed Rule 5. He nodded, swallowing, but the look in his eyes told me he knew the next rules would be far more challenging. The yacht waited, patient, deliberate, each rule a step deeper into something we could barely comprehend. Even as we ascended slightly to check our tether lines, I could feel the pull of the sunken yacht beneath us. Rule 5 had kept us alive this far, but the weight of the unknown pressed harder with every breath. I glanced at Marco, whose face was pale but resolute, and whispered, "One step at a time, the next rule is coming." The shadows of the wreck seemed to stretch, patient and unyielding, as though counting our adherence, waiting for the moment we might falter. Every rule was a tether, every rule a lifeline, and Rule 5 had reminded us that obedience was the only path to survival. Even after obeying Rule 5, the dread of the wreck never left me. The cargo hold loomed below us, a yawning cavern filled with rusting crates and shadows that seemed to twitch just beyond the beam of our flashlights. I clipped a secondary light to my wrist, its faint glow flickering in the murky water, reminding me that Rule 6 never enter the cargo hold without a secondary light source. Wasn't optional, it was survival. Marco glanced nervously at the entrance, his eyes reflecting the pale green of the glow. "I don't like this," he muttered, gripping the tether. I nodded, silently agreeing, knowing that venturing inside without a backup source could trap us in complete darkness with whatever lurked unseen. The hold's metal walls narrowed as we drifted further inside, the water thick with decades of sediment stirred by our movements. Shadows shifted unpredictably, forming shapes too deliberate to be currents alone. I reminded myself repeatedly that Rule 6 existed for a reason. The wreck had its secrets, and the cargo hold was a labyrinth no human eye could navigate without preparation. Marco's flashlight beam caught a crate that had shifted slightly, and I felt a pull to investigate, my curiosity testing the rule. I clenched my fists and forced myself to float past, letting the secondary light guide our path. A faint scraping sound echoed from deeper inside, reverberating off the rusted hull. I froze, heart hammering, and shined the backup light toward the noise. Nothing moved, or at least nothing visible, but the sense of being observed was overwhelming. Rule 6 pulsed in my mind like a warning siren. The secondary light wasn't just precaution, it was our connection to reality, our tether in the growing darkness that seemed to press against our bodies. Marco swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the tether, and I whispered, "Stay close, don't lose the light. That's Rule 6. The deeper we drifted, the more oppressive the water became, thick with rust flakes and tiny debris that swirled in the current. Our primary flashlights couldn't penetrate every corner, making the secondary light essential. I noticed a shadow flicker along the far wall, elongated and unnatural, and felt the familiar tug of fear. Marco's eyes widened, following the movement, and I forced myself to exhale slowly. "It's okay," I murmured, though my own voice trembled. "We have Rule 6. Keep the backup light on, don't panic, and we get through this." The words felt like a lifeline, a thread of control in the chaos surrounding us. One of the crates shifted violently, as if nudged by an unseen hand, sending a cloud of sediment swirling around us. I shone both lights, catching glimpses of shapes that didn't belong, long twisting shadows that seemed to move independently of the water. I gripped the tether, feeling the rule's weight pressing on me. Rule 6 demanded preparation, foresight, and constant vigilance. Any lapse, even a second of distraction, could leave us blind, floating in a darkness that the wreck seemed determined to exploit. Marco exhaled sharply through his regulator, the bubbles rising in turbulent streaks. "This is insane," he whispered, voice shaking. I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on our lights, mapping every corner with methodical care. The secondary light flickered slightly, sending long shadows dancing across the metal crates. Rule 6 demanded I keep it steady, unbroken, a continuous line of sight through the hold's oppressive darkness. I could feel the yacht itself pressing closer, testing our obedience, gauging our fear, and waiting for a mistake that might cost everything. A sudden shift in water pressure made me nearly lose my balance, and I clutched the tether tightly. Marco's light wavered dangerously as his hand brushed against a crate, sending it tilting slightly. I hissed at him, "Focus. Keep your secondary light steady. That's Rule 6. The crate settled back into place, as if nothing had happened, but the warning hung heavy in the water. Every corner, every shadow, every creaking metal beam reminded me that the cargo hold was a trap for the careless, a test of discipline and attention. We continued through the hold, moving slowly and deliberately, scanning every inch with our combined lights. The air, or water rather, felt thick with awareness, an almost sentient pressure that followed our every motion. I reminded myself that the backup light was not just a tool, but a shield, a barrier against whatever lurked in the unlit corners. Rule 6 wasn't optional. It was the difference between returning to the surface or being consumed by the silent, patient darkness. Marco's eyes never left his light, and I knew he understood the stakes as well as I did. By the time we reached the far side of the cargo hold, I was exhausted, muscles trembling from constant vigilance. Yet Rule 6 had kept us alive, guiding our path and anchoring us in reality. The shadows lingered, patient and deliberate, but our lights illuminated every obstacle, every potential hazard, keeping us connected to the surface and each other. Marco exhaled shakily, and I whispered, "We survived this, but the next rule will be worse." The wreck seemed to hum around us, patient and waiting, reminding me that the rules weren't merely instructions. They were lifelines in a place designed to punish curiosity and carelessness. Even now, as we moved back toward the main deck, I could feel the weight of the sunken yacht pressing against us. Rule 6 had guided us safely, but it was only one thread in a web of rules we had yet to navigate. The next step would demand even more vigilance, more restraint, and deeper respect for the unseen forces inhabiting the wreck. The sunken yacht was patient, deliberate, and unyielding, and I knew that breaking the next rule, even slightly, might not give us another chance. Even after exiting the cargo hold, a lingering unease weighed on me, a subtle pulse in the water that I couldn't ignore. The shadows of the sunken yacht seemed to stretch and twitch with a life of their own, and Rule 7 echoed in my mind. Never ignore signs of movement in the water around the wreck. I glanced at Marco, who floated tensely beside me, flashlight beams dancing over debris that shifted slightly with the current. Every instinct screamed that the yacht wasn't just a lifeless shell. It was patient, deliberate, and aware, and we couldn't afford to dismiss anything that moved. A faint ripple near the railing caught my eye, tiny eddies forming in patterns that made no sense with the current. I held my breath, gripping the tether from Rule 3, and whispered, "Did you see that?" Marco nodded, eyes wide, his regulator trembling. "Yeah, something moved, but it's probably just sediment." I shook my head, feeling a cold pressure in my chest. Rule 7 wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning, a constant reminder that what we didn't notice could strike when we were unprepared. As we moved along the deck, more subtle movements appeared, crates shifting just slightly, ropes swaying though the water was still, a shadow gliding along the hull that vanished when we looked directly at it. The sunken yacht seemed alive, testing us, measuring our reactions. I reminded myself repeatedly that ignoring these signs could be fatal. Rule 7 demanded vigilance, attention, and trust in instincts I had barely begun to understand. Marco's hands shook as he adjusted his light, clearly unsettled by the subtle but deliberate activity around us. A long, thin shadow moved between two beams ahead, quick and deliberate, vanishing before I could identify it. My heart hammered, and I grabbed Marco's arm, whispering urgently, "Don't ignore it, that's Rule 7. Everything that moves matters." He swallowed hard, eyes wide as he followed the motion I couldn't track. The water itself felt alive, each ripple carrying a presence we couldn't name, and I realized that the yacht's danger wasn't in the wreckage itself. It was in its subtle, patient manipulation of the water around us. A sudden swirl near the deck ladder made my stomach lurch. Something brushed past my suit, almost imperceptibly, yet the sensation was unmistakable. I held the tether tighter, shining both lights toward the disturbance. Rule 7 pulsed in my mind, a reminder that every motion mattered, and ignoring even a small sign could have deadly consequences. Marco exhaled shakily, muttering, "It's following us." I nodded grimly, knowing he was right. The yacht's presence was patient, deliberate, and increasingly insistent. We continued along the deck, each step measured, eyes scanning the water for the slightest shift. Shadows darted just beyond the flashlight beams, subtle enough to be dismissed, but impossible to ignore. I whispered the rule aloud, almost as a mantra. Rule 7, never ignore movement. Nothing is meaningless here. Marco's breathing quickened, bubbles streaming upward, as he strained to see what I saw. The yacht seemed to react to our attention, calm in the knowledge that our compliance might yet save us, but ready to punish a single lapse. Suddenly, a rope tethered to the hull jerked violently, and sediment clouded the water around it. My heart pounded as I remembered Rule 7, and I directed both lights toward the disturbance. Marco followed my gaze, his eyes wide, and we both froze. The movement wasn't random, it was deliberate, almost sentient, a reminder that the wreck was alive in ways we couldn't comprehend. Obedience to the rules wasn't enough, unless we noticed every subtle sign, every ripple that indicated the presence of something patient and waiting. We drifted past the stern, careful to note every twitch, every shift in the water, every movement that seemed out of place. Rule 7 guided us, an invisible instruction that demanded attention and respect. Even the faintest ripple could signify danger, and ignoring it would be foolish. Marco's nerves were fraying, but he mirrored my vigilance, keeping both eyes and lights trained on the surrounding water. The wreck seemed to pulse with quiet menace, testing our obedience and patience with every subtle motion. By the time we returned to the main deck, our muscles ached, and our minds were strained from constant vigilance. Yet Rule 7 had kept us alive, forcing us to pay attention to the smallest details and to respect the subtle movements that could indicate unseen threats. The yacht waited patiently, deliberate and unyielding, as though measuring our readiness for the next trial. I glanced at Marco, whose face was pale but alert, and whispered, "We survived this, but the next rule will push us further." The shadows of the wreck seemed to pulse with anticipation, ready to confront us with the unknown. Even now, floating above the hull, I could feel the water alive around me, subtle ripples carrying the yacht's attention. Rule 7 had taught us that survival depended on perception as much as obedience. Every movement mattered, every shadow was a warning, and we had to remain vigilant to endure the remaining rules. The sunken yacht was patient and deliberate, and I knew the next rule would demand even more focus, discipline, and respect for the unseen forces that ruled the depths. As darkness fell, the ocean's surface transformed into a black mirror, reflecting nothing but my own anxious face through the mask. I could feel the wreck beneath us, a vast skeleton hiding untold secrets, and Rule 8 pressed in my mind: never swim above the wreck at night. The water was too still, too silent, and every shadow seemed alive, waiting for us to make a fatal mistake. Marco adjusted his lights, exhaling in tension, and I whispered, "Stay close." We followed the rule. The surface looked calm, but I knew from experience that the yacht's danger was not only below but above, where unseen eyes could strike without warning. We moved carefully along the wreck's upper deck, the last beams of light from our dive lights barely cutting through the growing darkness. A faint ripple disturbed the water above, and my stomach tightened. Rule 8 reminded me that the night brought more than mere shadows. It amplified the wreck's awareness, turning the water above into a trap. Marco hesitated, glancing upward, the tension in his body palpable. "It feels wrong," he whispered, voice trembling. I nodded, gripping the tether and urging us forward, knowing that the rule existed for reasons I couldn't yet comprehend. The ocean above seemed heavier, pressing down with a patient, unseen weight. I could see the faint outlines of the hull looming below us, and every instinct screamed that the surface was no longer safe. Rule 8 pulsed in my mind with every stroke, insisting we stay close to the wreck, but never break the rule by drifting above. Marco's flashlight flickered, and I reached out, steadying him. "Focus on the lights in the hull. Don't look up. That's Rule 8, I murmured, hoping he understood the silent urgency. The current shifted subtly, as if nudging us toward disobedience, testing our discipline. A shadow passed above the wreck, elongated and dark, moving in ways that defied the water's currents. My heart pounded, and I tightened my grip on the tether, feeling the yacht's patient awareness pressing against us. Rule 8 wasn't just precaution, it was survival. I could sense the presence above, deliberate and waiting, testing our obedience. Marco exhaled sharply through his regulator, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's there above us." I nodded, my throat tight, and whispered back, "Keep moving, don't break the rule." Rule 8. We traced the contours of the upper deck, careful not to drift into the shadowed water above. The yacht seemed to pulse beneath us, alive with anticipation, every motion deliberate and measured. Rule 8 demanded vigilance. The night amplified dangers that daylight masked. A rope dangled precariously, swaying in currents we couldn't see, and I forced myself to ignore the urge to inspect it. Marco followed suit, though I could feel his tension radiating through the tether. One misstep above the wreck at night, and the patient predator below would strike with unforgiving precision. Suddenly, the water above shimmered unnaturally, faint ripples forming shapes that were impossible to identify. My hands tightened around the tether, and I repeated Rule 8 in my mind like a mantra, forcing focus. Marco's breathing quickened, and I could feel his fear as we moved carefully along the hull. Every subtle movement above the wreck mattered, and the night made them impossible to ignore. Ignoring even a single ripple could invite consequences far beyond anything we'd yet encountered. As we navigated past jagged railings and broken masts, the shadows above seemed to follow, stretching and twisting with an almost sentient patience. Rule 8 demanded we never look or swim above the wreck, and I clung to that rule with every fiber of my being. Marco's lights bounced nervously over the deck, illuminating every jagged surface and fragment of debris, but the real danger was above, in the unseen currents and shadows. I whispered, "Stay tethered, stay low, follow Rule 8. That's how we survive." The pressure of the night seemed to grow, the darkness pressing in on us from every direction. By the time we reached the edge of the upper deck, exhaustion had settled into our limbs, but Rule 8 had kept us safe. The shadows above remained patient, deliberate and unyielding, as if measuring our compliance. Marco exhaled shakily, muttering, "I don't know if I can ever get used to this." I shook my head, still scanning the black surface above, knowing the wreck demanded obedience at all times. The night amplified danger, and the rule had reminded us that even when we thought we were safe, patience and vigilance were the only ways to endure the sunken yacht's relentless attention. Even now, as we floated along the wreck, the weight of the night pressed down, and I could feel the yacht's unseen gaze following our every move. Rule 8 had been a lifeline in the black water above, guiding our path and forcing discipline we could barely sustain. Every ripple, every subtle current reminded me that the rules were more than instructions, they were survival. The sunken yacht was patient, deliberate, and eternal, and the next rule promised to push our endurance even further into the unknown. By the time we reached the stern, the weight of every previous rule pressed on me, a suffocating awareness of the yacht's patience and precision. Rule 9 thundered in my mind: never attempt to leave the wreck without following the previous 8 rules in exact order. Every step we had taken, every shadow observed, every tether held, every light kept alive, it all mattered now. Marco's grip on the tether tightened, his eyes wide as he glanced nervously at the black water stretching above and around us. "Do you think we can get out?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I swallowed hard, knowing that any misstep now could undo everything. The hull beneath us groaned as if alive, echoing through the water in a low, deliberate pulse. I traced our path slowly, mentally ticking off Rule 1 through Rule 8, ensuring that each had been obeyed to the letter. The wreck seemed to watch, its presence patient yet heavy, pressing on us with invisible weight. Marco's flashlight flickered, and I caught him staring at a dangling rope. "Don't touch it," I hissed almost desperately, reminding him that Rule 4 had to be respected still. The slightest deviation from the rules could mean vanishing into the silent abyss forever. As we followed the course we had marked through the wreck, the shadows seemed to shift, growing darker, more deliberate. I could feel a presence pressing in from all directions, patient and unwavering, as if the yacht itself were testing our obedience. Rule 9 demanded perfect adherence. Leaving the wreck required that every other rule had been obeyed without exception. Marco's breathing quickened, bubbles streaming up in frantic patterns. "I can feel it. It's all around us," he muttered, voice barely audible over the pressure of the water. I nodded grimly, forcing focus on the tether, the lights, and every subtle movement in the surrounding darkness. The path back to the surface seemed longer than it had when we first descended, the wreck twisting and stretching as if deliberately confusing us. I gripped the tether tightly, repeating Rule 3 silently, ensuring our line to the surface remained intact. Every step was deliberate, every motion considered. The sunken yacht was patient, but relentless. Marco stumbled slightly, and I caught him whispering, "Remember Rule 6 and your secondary light. We can't afford mistakes now." He nodded, trembling, understanding that failure wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. A shadow shifted above the wreck, long and slow, almost patient in its movement, reminding me of Rule 8. I swallowed hard, forcing my panic down, and guided us along the deck with slow, measured strokes. The yacht's presence seemed to thrum through the water, deliberate, constant, pressing against our resolve. Rule 9 demanded that the order be perfect. Any skipped step or hesitation could leave us stranded in the dark forever. Marco exhaled shakily, following every move, his eyes wide as he tried to comprehend the silent, watchful force surrounding us. As we neared the main ascent point, I could feel the tension peak, every shadow and ripple magnified by the strict requirements of Rule 9. I glanced at Marco, who was pale and exhausted, and whispered, "We're almost there. Keep everything in order. Follow each rule." The wreck seemed to hold its breath, waiting for us to make the slightest misstep. I forced my body to move deliberately, lights cutting through the murky water, tether taut, mind tethered to every rule that had kept us alive. The ascent to the surface was slow, deliberate, a careful retracing of our path through the sunken skeleton of the yacht. Each rule repeated itself in my mind, a mantra, a guide through the dark. Rule 9 demanded patience, precision, and respect for the sequence of survival we had followed so far. Marco exhaled heavily, trying to stay calm, eyes darting to every shadow above and below. I whispered encouragement, but inside, I felt the weight of the yacht's attention pressing relentlessly against us, testing our obedience until the very last moment. Finally, the light of the surface cut through the dark water, pale and distant but real. The tether felt taut, the secondary light steady, and every shadow we passed seemed to retreat slightly, acknowledging our careful adherence to the rules. Rule 9 had guided us, the culmination of every step, every rule, every restraint. Yet the wreck beneath us remained patient and deliberate, a silent observer that would wait for the next intruder, the next violation. Marco's face was pale but relieved, and I could only whisper, "We survived, but it's still watching." As we broke the surface, gasping in the open air, the sunken yacht seemed to settle below, patient, deliberate, and eternal. I knew that Rule 9 wasn't just about leaving. It was about understanding that the wreck's rules were absolute, and survival depended on perfect adherence. Even now, as the waves lapped gently around us, the shadows and silence beneath reminded me that the yacht's presence never left. Every ripple, every shadow, Every forgotten tether or light could have been our last mistake. We had obeyed, but the rules remained, patient and unyielding, waiting for the next diver foolish enough to ignore them. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.